Now, before we get to today's podcast, we're going to go over again the idea that anybody who's willing to can go over to my Patreon page right here. It's called Challenge History. It's https //www.patreon.com/challenge history. And if you donate base level, anybody that level, that'll be anybody donates $1 per level. That'll be a base level. $10 level would be anybody donates $10 to $24 level. $25 level will be $24 to $49. $50 level, $50 to $99, and $100 level, $100 and up. I just wanted to keep the names of the levels very, very simple. For the sole reason that it doesn't make sense to kind of make silly names for each of the levels. When you see the different levels with it, the $50 level is kind of the those are going to be named as the kind of the prime as the prime members with it of the club with it. Once you get to the $100 level per month. Or more per month, you will be able to request within reason, make requests for the podcast topics, and feel free to just send them send them in. Those people will get first access to get their topics requested. General people can make requests with it, but usually when it comes down to it, is these people will get their requests usually answered very, very fast, and they can actually get their requests bumped up above normal topics that were normally scheduled. Other people it might take up to a month or so for their topics to get put into the schedule, if they do get scheduled. Now, at each level with it, there'll be different things with it. Maybe later on down the road, I might add giveaways to certain levels with it. Though those would probably be set for higher donation levels, and because I would want to at least make it something decent, and I would want to make it to where it'd be worth it for me to buy something with the donations coming in, and it would be and then it would be one of those donors of that level, and there would be probably something for on the $50 club level, and probably something for the $100 club level would be the ones that I would probably do it for. Maybe on like a quarterly basis, maybe a yearly basis on like the $25 club level, and the $10 club level. The base level would probably not be entered in on that. Unless there were a bunch of people, then there would probably be just like one winner on the yearly level. And that would be how I would function it. But when we get back down to it, let's get back to the actual topic, because I know you're looking forward to that, and not looking forward to me just hacking my Patreon page. So this is about the Third Amendment. Now, most people think of the Third Amendment as kind of a toss-away amendment because they figure it as not really meaning much. But if we look at it, it was actually kind of meaning a lot toward the time with it, especially when we look at the actual Fourth Amendment, which we're going to get to tomorrow. Now, this one, you would think, this one says, no soldier shall be quartered in the peace, shall be no soldier shall in the time of peace be quartered in any house without the consent of the owner, nor in time of war, but in a manner prescribed by law. Now, this could essentially be very, very important when it comes to a leader that might want to have the idea of trying to prescribe the idea of and pass the idea of declaring martial law. Because martial law would essentially want to would need something of soldiers entering, and they would need something such as soldiers having access to areas that would not be bases, because otherwise they were only at bases, then they could not have any effective source. So they would need something, they would need to be declared. Well, this is essentially something that would essentially block such a necessary provision, and why it is necessary that we use something like this, because they essentially they would have to pass something legally by law, and not beyond just declaring martial law, but pass something legally to essentially allow it in, because martial law would not be technically a time of war, nor because we know by a time of peace essentially it would be illegal. They would essentially have to declare martial law as a time of war, which means they would essentially need to go to Congress to declare essentially a civil war. That's number one. And number two, they would need to essentially they would need the legitimate rights to beyond that time of war to declare another law allowing soldiers to be declared allowed to be quartered in homes without the consent of the owner. Now, this would be very, very difficult to pass, because we know that basically is the likelihood of that happening with a presidential leader would be very, very unlikely. Even if a leader were to declare martial law, such as when martial law was declared by Marcos in the Philippines, we know that he had detractors in his own within the own political system, and it would never have been even remotely plausible for them to do that, for him to be able to use his own military with that. So if we look at this system, that amendment right there would essentially eliminate their ability to have that. Now, in a system to where we have our military bases too spread out to allow that, that would essentially mean that basically most cities would essentially be without military order, meaning that martial law is essentially not attainable. And there would essentially be many cities that would essentially be not under this martial law that the president would want to declare. And they would pretty much, anything the president would order, pretty much the cities could basically say to the president, get bent, because there wouldn't be any authority to enforce it. Because when you declare martial law, you're then using the military to enforce it. You no longer have the Justice Department through the police officers within the region, to local police officers within the region, to enforce it. The police officers now are working on the behalf of the people, because you've now declared martial law, and there's now going to be a breakdown of the way the system's going to work. There's going to be essentially a split. And that's why this law right here becomes very important, because without that declaration of those laws and complete and utter cooperation on both parties to pass such a law, essentially that law would have to be passed in actually a time where martial law was not declared, or well before even the thought would be even declared. It would essentially not exist, and it could never exist. Meaning that until you get both parties to basically be completely in compliance with one another on this one issue, which is not likely, because they would be both parties would essentially be in fear of one another, of the other basically trying to take advantage of the other. It would basically not happen, because right now, as we have, especially with the Russia election hoax conspiracy out there, and other garbage like that, it's not likely to actually happen. So when we see stuff like that, is you're not going to see both parties coming together, because we're going to have basically a group of rational people that are going to say, no way in hell are we going to allow this. You're going to also see partisan people that are going to say, I'm not going to let the Democrats have access to something like this. And you're going to have the Democrats say, the Republicans, I'm not going to let them have access to stuff like this. So you can have all three groups of people say, hell no, and you're left with an implausibility of this happening. This is why this becomes very, very crucial, which means that when it says prescribed by law, specifically right here, which means that this without consent by owner, if the owners tell them no, tell the military no, they can't come in. And if they try to bust in, that's no different than coming in without a warrant. And that owner has full right to defend his own property. With the military is no different than someone breaking and entering illegally. No different than a common thief down the block. And the military would know that, so they would most likely not and move on to the next person. Meaning that this would be impossible, and that's what makes this thing very, very, very interesting, because it does have applications in a modern day system, for which an executive might want to severely abuse their power. Because what we would see is someone trying to declare martial law, and they'd say, well, you don't really have the teeth to actually enforce it, because the police are going to tell you no. They're going to say, we're with our local communities. We're not going to. You've declared martial law. We're not going to enforce it We're not going to enforce this anymore. You're no longer judgment on this. You're using the military now, and the military do not have the authority anymore beyond within the only housing areas that they have are their bases. And if we look at the locations of the bases, they're going to be going back and forth to enforce these areas, which will be nearly impossible. And when it comes to the actual sale of goods with it, they can essentially tell the government, no, we're not going to sell you goods because there's because there's essentially the breakdown with it. They essentially view them as a threat, and there's going to be that whole point, and they can essentially refuse based on that whole point of them viewing them as an actual threat to the community. And they can essentially refuse based on those points, based because they're not basing it on any type of bigotry. They would actually fit under the law itself, which means the military would have to essentially get its fuel from elsewhere, which would essentially make which is what gives this teeth essentially a lot of law, or this law a lot of teeth. Sorry for misspeaking, but it would give this law a lot of teeth, and which makes the point with it, and that's why when we see certain you'll see certain states that essentially reiterate the point of stating that that federal agencies do not have the right to commandeer your vehicle during times of crisis. And you'll see several states that actually have reiterated this point, to say they don't have the right to commandeer a vehicle or any of your property, including firearms. And you'll see specific ones like that, because they understand that the federal government will try to use this for martial law. And even though they intended this for the purpose of, they knew that the soldiers were going to use this to violate, to essentially use this as an end around on the Fourth Amendment. The British soldiers were, they or even domestic soldiers would have, because essentially they already got their end around for entry and don't need a warrant anymore to search. They now understand that that this can actually interpret in many different other ways, other than just that initial point, because of the way it's written. And it doesn't just mean exactly what it means in its actual function. And when we look at that, it was written specifically for the point of not allowing them to do that, so they would have an end around. And that was so the whole point of saying, where they could say, oh, we're soldiers, we need to be quartered here, and then start looking through your papers and other effects, and using that as an end around for the Fourth Amendment. And while that was the case with it, there's other methods in which it can be interpreted in modern day times to essentially mean other meanings as well. And there's reasons why it was written as well in both effects. And the reason why they didn't want them to be quartered as well is because basically is once they're allowed to enter a person's home, they essentially have full access to whatever's in the home, regardless if they've asked for permission to go through your phone, go through your drawers, go through whatever, go through your cabinets, regardless if you've given them permission. They don't need to ask permission, because the fact is they've already gained access, they've already gained entrance, so they don't have to do that. There's no law that says they have to ask for permission. That's just basically house etiquette of when you actually stay over in someone's house. That's completely different from what is lawful, and that's a completely separate issue of what we're talking about here. And when we look at that angle of it, that's why we have this as well, is so they don't do that, and then we have that. Now, while soldiers are more apt to have a stronger, while these military members have a stronger connection to the Constitution than you will with civilian intelligence, they did put this in there for that point. Now, and this is why they did not want civilian intelligence to begin with. They knew that basically when you put in a group of people that took an oath to secrecy over an oath to the Constitution, that you were going to have problems. And they knew that specifically, and that's why they wanted people taking an oath to the Constitution if they were going to take an oath to anything. They would never have allowed a group of people taking an oath to secrecy to actually go and enter in the government. And that was the whole point. And they would have, that was the way the founders viewed it. An oath to secrecy is completely useless in their minds of the actual founders, because an oath to secrecy just means you're basically hiding things from the actual people that actually fund the actual, number one, they fund the government, number two, they actually are the owners of the government. When we actually talk in an actual stakeholder position, we're talking that they're the actual stakeholders on the government itself. So the idea of hiding it from the people is completely irrelevant. So the idea of having everything classified from them is irrelevant, and that's why when they do these things is you'll notice from the actual time of the actual government establishment is you'll notice the more we've put to civilian intelligence, the more things have been classified, and the reason why has been because the fact is they believe the government is a separate entity from the actual people, and it's the actual people who are the actual only stakeholders of the government. And if we actually believe this, then we should believe that the idea of things being classified on the whole are irrelevant. The only case is in the case where it becomes a necessary danger, and that's only in very, very rare occasions, and there's only a small handful of things. The rest of it, basically well over 99% of what gets classified, is complete and utter garbage. Like there's most of the stuff out there is complete garbage, and that's why when you get to civilian intelligence, every civilian intelligence agency can be eliminated because it's only caused harm to the people, and it's saying you don't have any these basically have stated you have no constitutional rights, and you have no you basically have no ability to understand what your government's doing, and that's what these civilian intelligence agencies have done. And they're actually not even lawful when it comes to the Constitution itself. That's why if they would have if they would have been viewed as lawful to begin with from the Constitution, they would have been there since the start. They wouldn't have created them after the fact if they didn't if they would have wanted them. That's why they weren't there at the beginning. We didn't have an FBI. We didn't have the NSA. We didn't have the CIA. We didn't have all this other garbage, and there was a reason for it. There was things after the fact. Okay, with like the Air Force. That's because there weren't planes at the time. But that's military. We had a military. Okay, you can add things. You can add things depending on the actual technology on the military. But you need to understand with it what is reasonable with the military. But when we view things with like this, is we need to understand there's a reason why they put this in there, and it's because they understood that even your best people in the military could be told to essentially violate people's rights and look for an end around. And because they didn't have civilian intelligence, so leaders would have tried to find an end around back then with it. And when it comes to people now with it, is they're essentially using for that background. And essentially we look at the Third Amendment right now, or in aspects right now, when we see what civilian intelligence uses, essentially it shows right there is that there's a reason why they put this specifically there is that it was meaning so there wasn't that end around. And when we see what they've done with the FISA courts, what the NSA has done, what the FBI has done, what all these other groups have done by spying on things without using a Fourth Amendment warrant of being very, very specific, we see that basically they have essentially violated it. And this Third Amendment is actually very, very specific in how it was meant to essentially kind of double up on what the Fourth Amendment was saying. Not only was it supposed to guard against martial law, it was also supposed to essentially state kind of like you were not supposed to, these soldiers are not supposed to have access to any of your things because of constitutional violations, because they're not supposed to have entry into it. And it's very, very specific. They essentially, not only do they do one amendment, they doubled up, and that's what we're talking about in the Third Amendment. And that's something that needs to be understood, and they're ignoring that fact. A lot of people think it's completely irrelevant. Oh, we're not putting soldiers in people's houses. Well, the fact is what you're doing is essentially you're allowing people to have access to their things by using back doors. It meant that basically this was about essentially putting back doors in people's things for it, and that's what it was initially meant for, as well as to prevent against martial law. Those were two outcomes of what it was meant to do. To essentially prevent and double up what was happening with the Fourth Amendment. The Fourth Amendment was the first line of defense, and the Third Amendment was essentially the second line, even though the Third Amendment was listed as first, despite what it states there. And that's why we have them like that. Now, if you like this, like, subscribe, click the notification bell, share it all the way on social media. Share it to your friends, share it publicly, see if you can't donate anything on my Patreon page. And for any donations, I really appreciate that. And I will see you guys later. If not, probably it'll be earlier. It might be earlier than this because my live stream times, depending on how this thing loads. And that's about it. Bye, everyone.